Chapter 45. Ride Out the Crazy. Summary. It's up to Katsuki to wrangle the idiots until they're better. Things only get more chaotic. Katsuki was not happy with being woken up in the middle of the night. Someone was nudging his shoulder and they would not stop. "What the fuck is it?" he grumbled into the night. "Kachan!" Deku hissed. "Wake up! Ochako forgot her gloves when she went to sleep." Immediately, Katsuki shot up from his place in the sleeping pile. Mei groaned at the disturbance, rubbing her eyes sleepily, but Katsuki didn't have time to care. Looking up at the moonlit sky, he saw the sleeping form of Ochako, drifting into the void. Fuck! There was a reason Ochako had to wear gloves, or at the very least, something that covered her pinkies, to sleep. Just because she was unconscious didn't mean that her quirk stops working. It normally wouldn't be that big of a deal in a nice, secure dorm room, but out here, there is no convenient ceiling to keep her from floating off into space. It was a problem. Worst come to worst, they could wake her up. But that bubbly girl is an absolute nightmare when being woken up. Almost worse than when she plays Monopoly, and there was a good reason that game was banned in the dorms. He really didn't want to wake her up. He'd prefer not to wake up any of the sick teens if possible, which ruled out using his quirk. "Kachan, you have to do something before she flies away," Deku whined. He was really out of it at this point, so he'd be no real help. He'd done enough by telling Katsuki about Ochako, but he wondered why Izuku had woken up and noticed. Had he even been asleep in the first place? Katsuki didn't have time to think about that, though. How was he going to do this? Climb a tree? Looking around, he could see that there weren't any close enough to the floating girl. What could he do? Think. He really doesn't want to wake her up. "Grappling gun," Mei mumbles from her place in the pile. Out of God's nowhere, she brings out a grappling gun and hands it to him before promptly falling back to sleep. Okay. It looked pretty similar to a normal grappling gun. At least he thinks. He's never actually seen one in real life. Except instead of a hook at the end, there was a sticky rope. Hopefully, it wouldn't explode in his face, because he can't think of anything else. It's still better than waking Ochako up. "Yay!" Deku trails, draping onto his shoulder. "Did you know that the grass is listening? Don't let it steal your skin." Ignoring the crazy broccoli, Katsuki lines up the grappling gun and fires. The end gently wraps around Ochako's waist, only eliciting a small, sleepy grumble. He gently pulls her down as Deku burrows back into the pile. After pressing her fingers together and slipping her gloves on, he slumps back down into the pile, exhausted. Taking care of these idiots is like herding cats. And it's only going to get worse. Things were indeed worse on day 3. Denki and Mina were doing marginally better. Ochako was actually resting, but Deku and Mei were so much worse. Katsuki doesn't know how he's supposed to handle this, especially considering that he was getting sick himself. When he'd woken up for real that morning, he noticed an itching in his throat, but he just had to shut up and deal with it. The others were relying on him, and he dealt with doing stuff while sick his whole life. The hag didn't believe in sick days, so he'd always had to tough it out and pretend that nothing was wrong. He could do that again. And he really couldn't afford to rest when Deku had climbed into a tree and refused to come down. Whenever Katsuki tried to get close, the green-out would just hiss, like a cat. He also wouldn't stop shouting about how Mei was a skinwalker, not helped by the fact that Mei was running around the base of the tree, cackling. "Deku!" he shouted. "Cut the shit and come down." "No!" Deku hissed. "The grass can't have my skin!" "God fucking damn it!" Izuku surveyed the ground below him with watchful eyes. The skinwalker that had been given the pink-haired one's skin by the grass was still circling his perch. She wanted to let the grass steal his skin, but he wouldn't let it. He was smarter than that. Kacchan kept trying to tempt him down, but Izuku let out another hiss. The tree he had taken shelter in was nice. There were no branches low to the ground, so the skinwalkers were unable to get up. How had Izuku gotten up? Don't worry about it. He'd found a perfect nook to settle in, where he didn't have to worry about falling out. The soft bark was surprisingly comfortable and safe. It would keep them from watching. Just as he thought that, he saw a suspicious leaf. This could not stand in his nook. Izuku grabbed the leaf lightning fast and ate it. No witnesses. However, his eyelids were beginning to droop as the trees continued to whisper their secrets to him. Perhaps he could finally rest. It had been over 24 hours since he last slept, so when darkness called, he didn't resist. But unlike the oblivion he had been expecting, he woke to a void. Ah, the Ancient Ones had called to him at last! Time to sell his soul to Cthulhu! Izuku really hoped Nezu didn't mind. Maybe they could have joint custody of his soul. "Izuku, what are you doing here? We didn't call you, and One for All is still locked away," Nana suddenly said, clearly shocked at how the little green bean had appeared. Izuku attempted to let out a hiss, but his mouth was covered by mist. The undulating vapor immediately stole all of his attention, as he tried to eat it. It tasted like TV static, but he kept trying to bite it. Despite his effort, the mist wasn't going anywhere, but he wasn't going to give up so easily. He wouldn't be silenced. "Ninth!" he heard First shout. "How are you?" The greenette turned towards First with a slightly crazed look in his eyes. "Oh," First said knowingly. "You're like me and my brother when we get sick." Banjo was also here now, apparently. Izuku hadn't noticed him until he spoke. "How would you know he's sick?" Banjo said, unbelieving of First's wisdom. "And gets like what?" "Clinically insane and paranoid," First replied. Izuku glared. "It's not paranoia, if you're right." He wanted to say that, but he couldn't speak, so instead, he attacked. But First was prepared, dodging the lunging Izuku and pinning him to the ground. "So cute," First cooed. The other vestiges looked on in concern and slight alarm at the writhing Izuku. "Well, let's not waste this nice family bonding experience. Who wants to play Uno?" "Slow down, First," Second chided. "How did he get into the void in the first place? He couldn't even do that before the whole trafficking thing. Then there's also the fact that One for All is still locked away." First tisked. "He's doing such a good job. He's almost unlocked One for All again. You hear that, Ninth? You're almost there. You'll be back to breaking your bones in no time." Yoshi patted the pinned Izuku fondly on the head. Izuku tried to bite him, but missed, so it didn't really work. "Okay," First cheered. "Time for Uno." Deku eventually passed out in his little tree hidey hole, and Katsuki couldn't help but be thankful to have one less chaotic idiot to deal with. With the crazy bush no longer hyping Mei up, she was back to fiddling with some gadget that kept exploding every few minutes. At this point, it was just background noise to Katsuki. He was so fucking tired. It was a miracle he was able to get any sleep last night. It was a miracle he was able to get any sleep last night when the idiots actually quieted down. Despite that, he'd still only gotten a few hours thanks to Ochako's little floating interruption. But he had to keep pushing. Being sick wasn't an excuse to let himself slack off. So, for the remainder of the day, he corralled the idiots into the blanket pile, cooked them soup, made sure they stayed hydrated, and checked their temperatures regularly. Thankfully, they seemed to be getting better. Fevers were going down, and Deku had descended from the tree. He was muttering something about biting ghosts, but Katsuki wasn't paying attention to his craziness. Unfortunately, because they were feeling better, they were getting bored again. "Hey, Ocha," Deku mumbled, emerging from his spot under the blankets. "Your quirk is weird." It didn't look like Ochako knew how to respond. Thanks?" Deku nodded. "Sometimes, when you use it, you negate the other object's momentum and freeze it in place, like with me in the first time we met. But then other times, it just starts floating up, like with the robots at the entrance exam. And other times, the object keeps its momentum, like when you're running and you use your quirk on yourself." Ochako just stared at him, stunned. "I didn't even realize that was happening." Deku hummed. I didn't think so. But that might mean that you can control more than just whether or not gravity affects an object. You might be able to only partly decrease the gravity of something you touch, so it'd be like moon gravity. And you might be able to increase the gravity to make it be like being on Jupiter. But then there's the weird thing about momentum. I'm not really sure how to use that more than you already do, but it's worth taking note of." Ochako just gaped at Deku in complete shock and amusement. She's been friends with the nerd since the start of school, and she hasn't heard him dissect a quirk before? Katsuki would have thought he'd been all over his friends and their quirks with his stalker notebooks. Katsuki may call them stalker books, but that doesn't mean they aren't scary good. In fact, that's the whole reason he calls them that. After Izuku showed him his entry of his own quirk back in elementary school, Katsuki had avoided him like the plague for a week. Most of the theories on better ways to use his quirk were right, but still, it was a little disturbing. "Let's find out if you can do that stuff," Mina cheered. Denki was right on the hype train with her, pumping Ochako up until she agreed. Deku burrowed back under the blankets, but there was a little opening where he was watching through, notebook acquired from who knows where, at the ready. Katsuki couldn't bring himself to care, so he just watched as the three of them, Deku still watching from under the blankets, and Mei gutting the battered escape pod even further for more materials, messed around. Turns out, Ochako can choose whether an object stops in midair or continues moving, which the idiots tested by jumping out of trees. That nearly gave him a heart attack. She can also make objects float, which prompted Deku to start muttering about the missing repulsive half of gravity. Then they moved on to trying to make things slightly less affected by gravity. It took a while, but with nothing else to entertain them with, Ochako was eventually able to make a rock fall to the ground like a balloon, which was trippy. By the evening of the fourth day, they're definitely past the worst of it. Denki and Mina are walking around again. Mei has ceased her escape attempts. Deku is back to just being clingy, and Ochako is still a little out of it, thanks to her refusal to rest earlier. Speaking of refusal to rest when you're sick, Katsuki is feeling like shit. His head is pounding. He definitely has a fever, and he's racked with chills. But he has to keep going. Just because the others are getting better doesn't mean that the virus has completely run its course. He can't rest. Those idiots still need his help. He's fine. This is not that different from that time in 5th grade. He was fine going to school then. He's fine now. Wait, now that he thinks about it, didn't he pass out at school? The only thought that registers in Kotsky's fever-hazed mind before his unconscious body hits the ground is, shit.